Saudi Arabia has the most uncertain future ahead of itself. The country truly has almost countless problems ahead of it that it must overcome in order to survive. And they've only been able to overcome all of these problems so far because of their dominance over a critical resource that everyone in the world has wanted for the past 100 years, but from which the world is currently starting to move away from: oil. The Saudi Arabian state is one that is nearly utterly defined by its control over this black liquidy resource. As recently as 2018, the petroleum business in the country accounted for a whopping 87% of the government's annual budget, 90% of the country's export earnings, and a massive 42% of the country's entire GDP. This is because Saudi Arabia is known today to control approximately a quarter of all the proven oil reserves in the world. The second largest reserves of all the world's countries, second only to Venezuela. But unlike Venezuela's technically larger oil reserves, which are highly crude, difficult, and expensive to access, Saudi Arabia's only slightly smaller reserves are located under pressure just beneath the Earth's surface, and they are extremely easy and cheap to access, and they're much easier to refine. This is why for decades, Saudi Arabia was the largest producer of oil in the world, and is currently the world's second largest producer, just barely behind the United States. Alongside Russia, these three countries are collectively referred to as the Big Three of global oil production today, because no single other country comes anywhere close to matching them, and they combined produce approximately 40% of all the oil in the world. But America's population is 332 million, and so most of America's oil production is consumed within the country and not exported abroad, which is why America is only the world's 14th largest oil exporter. Saudi Arabia has just about a tenth of the American population, but produces nearly as much oil as it, meaning that they simply have far more that they can never possibly consume on their own, and so they have far more left over to export to other countries. Saudi Arabia is thus by far the largest exporter of oil in the world. And oil continues to provide roughly a third of all the energy that humanity collectively consumes worldwide. Countries like India, China, Japan, South Africa, and numerous European states all import enormous volumes of their own oil supplies from Saudi Arabia, and are thus all heavily reliant on keeping those flows of oil continuing for now. It is this simple calculus that has given Saudi Arabia enormous geopolitical power and clout over the past century, because they've just got more oil to give others than anybody else. And more than any other country, Saudi Arabia is the one most capable of influencing the global price of oil, either negatively or positively. This is because, besides being by far the largest exporter of oil, Saudi Arabia also has by far the largest spare capacity of oil production. And this is what truly gives the Saudi state its unbelievable levels of global power. Spare capacity in the oil business refers to the number of oil wells that a country possesses that are not currently being used, but which can be brought online again in a very short notice to rapidly increase production. Saudi Arabia wields the largest spare capacity of oil production in the world, and they usually keep around 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day of oil production reserved in this spare capacity. By rapidly turning this spare capacity back online, Saudi Arabia can rapidly increase its globally significant oil production and dump those extra supplies onto the world market, thus decreasing global prices of oil. And by doing the reverse, by shutting more wells offline and increasing its available spare capacity, Saudi Arabia can rapidly decrease its globally significant oil production and restrict global oil supplies, thus increasing worldwide oil scarcity and increasing global oil prices. This is why Saudi Arabia is often referred to as the central bank of world oil, and it's how the Saudi state can exert significant leverage over every single country in the world, including the world's most powerful country, the United States. While America only imports a fraction of its oil supply from Saudi Arabia these days, overall oil prices in the United States can still be severely impacted by the whims of the absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia. After the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the Western world immediately passed a series of sanctions against Russia that shut that country's oil supply out of their markets, which obviously reduced the supply of oil in their markets and led to a rise in oil prices. And when oil prices rise, it tends to increase inflation in every other sector of the economy, because nearly every business in the world relies on oil at some point in time in its production process. Which means that when oil prices go up, businesses have to raise their prices in order to offset their increased production costs. So, after the Russians invaded Ukraine and the global price of oil shot up, and inflation rates went up along with it, the Biden administration in the United States requested that Saudi Arabia turn more of their spare capacity on and ramp up production to place more oil onto the global market in order to decrease oil prices that would help tame global inflation. But the Saudis instead did the complete opposite. They ended up cutting more of their production over and over these past several months, adding more wells to their offline spare capacity and decreasing the supply of global oil in coordination with Russia, which is increasing oil prices around the world, which is enabling the Russians to earn more money on their own oil sales that is being plowed into waging their war in Ukraine, and it is increasing inflationary pressures in gasoline prices in the United States. As of May 2023, the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, the usually massive emergency stockpile of petroleum that the United States keeps stashed away in tanks in Louisiana and Texas to release during an oil supply crisis, has been gradually depleted every single day since the invasion of Ukraine began, to the lowest level seen in 40 years right now since 1983. Doing so has helped tame gasoline prices in the country for now, but with the reserve now heavily depleted, Washington possesses very little other options available to keep gasoline prices from spiraling upwards leading up to the November 2024 presidential election, other than calling Saudi Arabia and requesting them to turn more of their spare capacity back online, which the Saudis will surely only do if they are given certain favors. This is precisely how Saudi Arabia is able to wield its oil might and exert geopolitical influence across the entire world in the process. But Saudi Arabia's great challenge in the 21st century is that this greatest of its powers has a finite lifespan remaining. And at a certain point in the future, a day will come when this power will completely evaporate altogether. Because over the next several decades, as countries around the world steadily continue moving their economies away from oil as an energy source, Saudi Arabia's great advantage of being the global oil business's central bank will matter less and less. And if the country does nothing to change itself between now and whenever that uncertain future date arrives, it will only be left with sand, one of the worst human rights records on the planet, an archaic religious absolute monarchy that most of the outside world finds repugnant, and a lack of protection from the United States, while being surrounded by countless enemies from both within and without. If Saudi Arabia does nothing to change, Saudi Arabia will no longer exist at all by the end of the century. But change is also going to be very, very hard and uncertain. And if you want to understand where Saudi Arabia is going in the future, you've got to understand where Saudi Arabia came from in the first place, and why the country would have almost certainly never managed to exist at all in its current form, were it not for the very fortunate discovery of oil very early on into its history. For thousands of years, the Arabian Peninsula was divided between various different tribes, sheiks, kings, and empires. There was very little to note about the lands in the center of the Arabian Peninsula where the House of Saud first originated in history, a little more than 300 years ago, in a region known as the Najd. The overwhelming majority of Saudi Arabia's current lands are completely uninhabitable. The country is, after all, the largest in the world today that doesn't have a single river anywhere to be found within it. Rainfall across most of the country's land is extremely scarce, and so fresh water for drinking and agriculture have historically been extremely difficult to come by. Across the south of the modern country is a vast desert known as the Rub al-Khali, better known in English as the Empty Quarter. It is the largest continuous expanse of sand that can be found anywhere in the world. It is nearly completely devoid of life, and it is larger in area than the entirety of France. The region of Najd, deep within the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, was an extremely sparsely populated and isolated backwater, separated from the rest of the world by vast empty deserts and high mountains with nothing of value to offer anyone in the outside world. It was a place hardly anyone paid any attention to, and its extreme isolation from the rest of the world was partially why an extremely strict interpretation of Sunni Islam gradually developed there, now sometimes known as Wahhabism. It was an unlikely place from which one of the most powerful nations of the modern world would arise from, but so it did regardless. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, two small and largely unknown family clans within the Najd region cemented an alliance between themselves. The House of Saud, who would run the politics and day-to-day governance of the lands they controlled, and the clan of Wahhab, who would run the land's religious affairs based upon their own extremely strict interpretation of Sunni Islam, the previously mentioned branch of the faith that is sometimes referred to as Wahhabism. After joining forces, the Saud and Wahhab alliance went on to carve out the first Saudi state that survived between 1744 and 1814, before it was ultimately destroyed by the Ottomans. A group of survivors managed to take back the Saud's ancestral capital at Riyadh in 1818, and from there they carved out the second Saudi state that survived for most of the rest of the 19th century until 1891, when catastrophic infighting among the royal family and conflict with a rival family clan known as the Rashidis led to the state's ultimate collapse. The surviving Saud family members were forced to flee from Riyadh as exiles into nearby Kuwait, where they were powerless without any lands and without any wealth, but with a very good historical claim to the supposedly worthless lands of Najd in the interior of Arabia. There and then, the Saud family probably would have vanished into irrelevance, never to be seen or heard from again, were it not for the ambitions of a young